Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, and the Persians started the new year at the spring equinox. This was adopted by the Jews, who also adopted the Babylonian and Persian lunar calendars. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Jews called this month Nisan, and the Persians and Elamites called this month Adukhanisa. The Akitu festival, one of the oldest religious festivals in recorded history, if not the oldest, was celebrated at the spring equinox, originating in the 3rd millennium BCE. It was a significant celebration for the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, marking the planting of barley in early spring around March-April. On the Babylonian calendar, this is called Nisanu. This period heralded the new year. The Babylonians referred to it as the beginning of the year, Resh Shatim. During the early dynastic period, each Sumerian city-state celebrated its own festivals to honor its patron deity. This tradition persisted into Akkadian period in the 3rd millennium BCE, with a broader scope extending across Sumer to venerate the supreme deities of Akkad, Anu, Enlil, and Enki along Ishtar, originating as the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Among the most ancient ceremonies were those dedicated to Tammuz, or Dumuzi, an agricultural barley, grain, and vine deity symbolizing death and rebirth, whose rituals often involved elaborate mourning practices. These rites depict Dumuzi's death and resurrection, symbolizing the cycle of fertility and abundance. These celebrations maintain the foundational aims established by early Sumerian traditions to pay homage to the divine, affirm the sovereignty of the monarch, and foster a shared sense of faith and communal practice among the populace. This multifaceted celebration took place in 2 key locations. In Babylon, the Esagila temple, dedicated to the supreme deity Marduk, and the House of the New Year, situated to the city's north. Central to the festivals were Nabu and his father Marduk, who was later synced with Tammuz, often called Bel, or Lord, in the 1st millennium BCE, as Marduk's name was deemed too sacred for regular utterance. Marduk would usurp Enlil's role as the king of the gods, and his mythologies are spread into many different gods who also take on traits of Tammuz, such as Bel Sarbi, Lord of the Poplar Tree, Dumuzi Amashgalana, Lord of the Date Palm, Ningishita, Lord of the Tree, sometimes seen as a chthonic twin of Tammuz, and Damu, the divine child. All of these being tree gods, vine gods, or gods of some type of vegetation, but Bel, or Lord, would end up as the syncretic deity that the Assyrians and Babylonians would spread to the west, who would go on to influence Semitic Baal and Adonis, who had major temples all throughout Syria, Phoenicia, and Judea. In the Baal cycle, a text that dates to 1500 BCE, in the Bronze Age, Baal is the son of El, the highest god, Elyon. Baal's death is announced to El, and El mourns for him. Mourning rites by El in the Knot, also equated with Ishtar, Baal's sister and consort. Just like Dumuzi, their mourning rites are described in detail. Later in the text, El has a dream that oil and honey rain down to restore the richness of the earth, a symbol of agriculture, which he believes is informing him that Baal has returned to life. Finally, Baal is seen riding in the clouds, and a description of his return to his throne is described. Once again, El, being the same name as the God of the Hebrew Bible, has a son who dies, resurrects, and is mourned over by women. Tammuz was named for the month of midsummer, when the crops are full and the sun is at its high point. But his death and resurrection were celebrated at the spring, when the crops returned from the underworld and the fertility of Ishtar, the dawn goddess, saves all mankind from the death of winter. There are two versions of this story. One of them is found in Nergal and Ereshkigal, and the other is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They both involve Ishtar, or Inanna, as the savior goddess of dawn, represented by the planet Venus, the star that is visible during the time of dawn when all the other planets and stars are no longer visible. In Nergal and Ereshkigal, the version of the descent of Ishtar, Tammuz is slain. Ishtar mourns over the death of Tammuz. Then she descends into Kernugi, the underworld, revives his corpse, and brings him back to the land of the living. And upon his resurrection, the dead are raised with him, and the crops and trees blossom and bring spring and warmth to the world.
He has gone to the bosom of the earth, and the dead are numerous in the land. Men are filled with sorrow, they stagger by day in gloom. In the month of thy year, which brings not peace, hast thou gone. Thou hast gone on a journey that makes an end of thy people. The Holy One of Ishtar, in the middle of the year the fields languish. The shepherd, the wise one, the man of sorrows, why have they slain? In his temple, in his inhabited domain, the child, Lord of knowledge, abides no more. In the meadows, verily, verily, the soul of life perishes. The welling is for the herbs. The first lament is, they are not produced. The welling is for the grain. Ears are not produced. The welling is for the habitations, for the flocks which bring forth no more. The welling is for the perishing wedded ones, for the perishing children. The dark-headed people create no more.
Ishtar mourns over the death of her lover, the shepherd god of agriculture, Tammuz. She then decides to descend into the land of no return, to face her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. Ishtar, when she arrived at the gates of Kernugi, Hades, addressed the gatekeeper.
I shall raise up the dead, and they shall outnumber the living.
In order to save him, she must descend through 7 gates of the underworld and remove 7 articles of clothing until she is naked, and then must face the judgment of Ereshkigal and ask her to return her lover Tammuz from death. Enki, the creator and god of wisdom, the Sumerian Prometheus, creates a trickster plot to help her succeed in her mission to resurrect the dead.
Enki, in the wisdom of his heart, created a person. He created the good looks playboy. Come, good looks the playboy, set your face toward the gates of Kernugi. The 7 gates of Kernugi shall be opened before you. Ereshkigal, the queen of Hades, shall look at you and be glad to see you. When she is relaxed, her mood will lighten. Get her to swear the oath by the great gods, Anunnaki. Raise your head, pay attention to the water of life, saying, Hey, my lady, let them give me the water skin that I may drink from it.
Now I want you to remember the good looks playboy for later in this video, because I think this can possibly be influential to the descent of Orpheus to Hades. More on that later. As a result of Enki's plan and Ishtar's descent, all goes well, and the plan is successful. Ishtar is brought in before the Anunnaki. She is sprinkled with the waters of life and ascends back up through the 7 gates of Hades, called Kernugi. Ereshkigal then addresses the Anunnaki and says,
Bring the Anunnaki out and seat them on golden thrones. Sprinkle Ishtar with the waters of life and conduct her in my presence. Ishtar was sprinkled with the waters of life and brought to her sister. She was led out through the first gate and given back the garment of her body. She was led out through the second gate and given the bangles of her wrists and ankles. Through the third gate, she was given her girdle and stones around her waist. Through the fourth gate, her toggle pins and breastplate. Fifth gate, beads around her neck. Sixth gate, rings for her ears. Seventh gate, her great crown for her head. Swear that she has paid her ransom and give her back Tammuz, the lover of her youth. Wash him with pure water, anoint him with sweet oil, clothe him in a purple robe. Let the lapis lazuli pipe play. Let the women raise a loud lament. On the day when Tammuz, comes back up, and the lapis lazuli pipe and the carnelian ring came up with him, when male and female mourners come up with him, the dead shall come up and smell the smoke offering. Descent of Ishtar to the underworld.
Not only is Tammuz raised from the dead, but he is also anointed in this text, which is what the word Christ actually means. According to Samuel Noah Kramer, a Syriologist and historian who has translated more Sumerian texts than anyone in world history, says that by the late 3rd millennium BCE, Uruk's rulers affirmed their authority through embodying Tammuz or Dumuzi during a sacred marriage rite. This ceremony, part of the Akitu festival marking the Sumerian New Year, occurred on its 10th day, which would fall exactly on the 14th of Nisan, the day that Jesus Christ was crucified, and they would perform a ritual marriage between Dumuzi and Ishtar to mark the spring equinox and New Year.
My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? As for me, the young woman, who will plow my vulva? Who will station the ox there? Who will plow my vulva? Make your milk sweet and thick, my bridegroom. My shepherd, I will drink your fresh milk. Wild bull, Dumuzi, make your milk sweet and thick. I will drink your fresh milk. Let the milk of the goat flow in my sheepfold. Fill my holy churn with honey cheese. Lord Dumuzi, I will drink your fresh milk.
In that particular passage, Ishtar is weeping for Tammuz, and this weeping for Tammuz is a ritual we see all across the Mediterranean and Near East in different cultures for mourning rituals for different gods. In the Gilgamesh version of the Descent of Ishtar, Tammuz is not the god who dies and rises again. It is Ishtar, called Inanna, who goes into Hades alone after the bowl of heaven is slain by Gilgamesh, and Inanna, who calls this bowl of heaven her husband, just like Tammuz. And Tammuz is also called a bull and is depicted with horns. But in this text, Gugulana is the bull and husband of Inanna, which is very confusing, but shows that there's obviously a connection to the death of Tammuz. Inanna descends into the land of the dead to save him, and she is hung and transfixed on the eye of death, almost like a crucifixion, is dead for 3 days, and then resurrects.
From the great above, Inanna opened her ear to the great below. Because of my older sister Erishkigal, her husband Gugulana, the bull of heaven, has died. I have come to witness the funeral rites, Ishtar says. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. Erishkigal, queen of Hades, responds to her sister Ishtar. The Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, surrounded her. They passed judgment against her. Then Erishkigal fastened on Inanna the eye of death. She spoke against her the word of wrath. She uttered against her the cry of guilt. She struck her. Inanna was turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat, and was hung from a hook on the wall.
Similar to Jesus, the text specifically states that Ishtar is dead for 3 days and 3 nights.
When, after 3 days and 3 nights, Inanna had not returned, Ninshubur set up a lament for her by the ruins. She beat the drum for her in the temple. She circled the houses of the gods. She tore at her eyes. She tore at her mouth. She tore at her thighs. She dressed herself in a single garment like a beggar. Alone, she set out for Nippur and the temple of Enlil.
Once again, it is Enki who saves the day, Inanna's father god Enki, who creates two Gala, two unique beings created neither male or female, to aid her in returning to Earth. The Gala enter the underworld like flies, and following Enki's specific instructions, attach themselves closely to Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, is seen in distress.
From under his fingernail, Father Enki brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into Kurgara, a creature neither male nor female. From under the fingernail of his other hand, he brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into a Galater, a creature neither male nor female. He gave the food of life to the Kurgara. He gave the water of life to the Galater. Enki spoke to the Kurgara and Galater, saying, "Go to the underworld. Enter the door like flies. Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, is moaning. Ask her only for the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall. One of you will sprinkle the food of life on it. The other will sprinkle the water of life. Inanna will rise." The Kurgara and the Galater heeded Enki's words. They set out for the underworld. Like flies, they slipped through the cracks of the gates. They entered the throne room of the queen of the underworld.
It is the third day that Ishtar is raised from the dead, as Enki, who is God the Father, sends down his angels, the Gali, to raise up the savior goddess Ishtar from the dead, and she is raised up from the dead, and the dead are raised with her.
Ereshkigal said, "Speak then. What do you wish?" They answered, "We wish only the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall." Ereshkigal said, "The corpse belongs to Inanna." They said, "Whether it belongs to our queen, whether it belongs to our king, that is what we wish." The corpse was given to them. The Kurgara sprinkled the food of life on the corpse. The Galater sprinkled the water of life on the corpse. Inanna arose.
As Ishtar is raised up, the crops and trees are also raised up. Her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of heaven, tells Ishtar that someone will need to take her place. But there is a twist in this version. When she arrives back at the land of living, she sees her lover Tammuz seated on a throne, wearing fine garments, anointing himself with oil, and drinking wine with temple prostitutes. She notices that he is not properly mourning her death. She is furious and decides to make a deal with her sister that she would allow for Tammuz to take her place for half the year in the underworld, while Ningishita would serve in her spot for the other 6 months. This 6-month system of returning to Hades, which causes the seasons to change, is later reflected in several other myths, such as with Adonis and Persephone, who take turns every 6 months in Hades, but I will speak more on that later. There is a book called Esther in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek Septuagint, wide-ranging in versions and manuscript traditions, but all about a Jewish queen named Esther, pronounced Esther in Hebrew, who lived in the Persian court of Xerxes along with Mordecai, who in Hebrew is Mardoki, and Mardochaeus in Greek. Notice the names Esther and Mardoki, which some scholars and myself have noticed sounds a lot like Marduk and Ishtar. In the longest extant version of the Book of Esther from the Septuagint, preserved in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and otherwise considered apocryphal, the story seems to align very much with the descent of Ishtar. Mardoki is in trouble in the court of Xerxes and is about to be slain due to Haman, one of the members of the court who plotted against Mardoki. In chapter 4, Esther, like Ishtar, ritually mourns for 3 days from Mardoki, and for the people of Israel, due to the situation they are under, being in a diaspora. The text reads,
"And all Israel cried with all their might, for the death was before their eyes. And Queen Esther betook herself for refuge to the Lord, being taken as it were in the agony of death. And having taken off her glorious apparel, she put on garments of distress and mourning. And instead of grand perfumes, she filled her head with ashes. and dung. She greatly brought down her body, and she filled every place of her gland, adorning with the torn curls of her hair. Esther 4:18.
We see a similar tearing and ash-covering mourning rite being taken up by Ishtar for Tammuz in Akkadian texts.
Why have you covered your head with a cloth? You who are a shepherd, how you walk about. Holy Ishtar weeps bitterly in her house, which having descended from heaven stands on the earth. She wears sackcloth and ashes, rips out her hair, tears her torn sinews, rips out her hair, plucks out her hair like burr rushes. The lady wept at the meaning of the decreed fate. Tammuz wept at the meaning of the decreed fate. The mourning for Tammuz.
The apocryphal manuscripts also have a similar plot as the Descent of Ishtar, in which Esther is attended by eunuchs, just as Ishtar was attended by the Gali, who are also eunuchs. Esther then descends through multiple portals in the palace until she is finally brought into the chamber of the king, where she puts on a royal attire, and like Ishtar, finds favor with the queen of Hades. Esther finds favor with King Xerxes.
On the third day, putting an end to her prayers, she took off her penitential garments and arrayed herself in royal attire. In making her state appearance, after invoking the all-seeing God and Savior, she took her 2 eunuchs. On the one she leaned gently for support, while the other followed her bearing her train. She glowed with the perfection of her beauty, and her countenance was joyous as it was lovely, though her heart was shrunk with fear. She passed through all the portals till she stood face to face with the king, who was seated on his royal throne, clothed in full robes of state, and covered with gold and precious stones.
Esther is able to sway the king to release Mordecai, and she saves all the Israelites from persecution. Mordecai is then given a purple robe and diadem that Haman wore before him, and Haman was then sentenced to die. The Descent of Ishtar also has Tammuz robed in purple and sitting on a throne towards the end. Also, in the epilogue, Mardaki relates that he had a dream about 2 dragons and a spring turning into a river and the light of the sun. He figures out that the river is Esther and the sun is the king, while the 2 dragons represent Mardaki and Haman. It seems obvious to me, and many other scholars in the past have also concluded, that the book of Esther is drawing heavily from the myths of Ishtar's descent to the underworld to save Tammuz, the god who by the Hellenistic era was synced with Marduk, called Bel, and had many temples in Syria, Phoenicia, and the Levant, and was known by the names Baal and Adonis. If the names Mardaki and Esther aren't enough to see the relations of Marduk and Ishtar, the story has these elements in common. Both Esther and Ishtar mourn for someone. They're both wearing sackcloth and ashes. They're both attended by eunuchs. They both seek deliverance from a god. They both descend through portals or gates. They both go face to face with the king or queen. They both find favor with king or queen. They both save someone from death, and that person that's saved from death is replaced by someone else. Another thing to note is that the festival of Purim, which commemorates the events of Esther, is celebrated at the 14th of Adar, which corresponds to mid-March, and is celebrated on March 23rd of 2024. I also think one can argue that Lent could very well have some of its roots in the rites of mourning, as the sources suggest that Lent could have multiple rites from several traditions synced together in the 4th century into what we know today as Lent, using the symbolic 40 days and 40 nights from Jesus in the desert. But as we shall see in the remainder of this video, ritual mourning before the spring is something that appears to be universal. Weeping for Tammuz was a rite that was well known in Israel, as Ezekiel states.
Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord. and I saw women sitting there, mourning the god Tammuz. Ezekiel 8:14.
Ritual mourning for the dead gods of agriculture was abundant in the ancient world. And just as Purim leads into Passover, the Akitu festival was kicked off on the 4th of Nisanu, 10 days before the spring equinox, with the high priest of Esagila declaring the new year's start, initiating a week-long public holiday. The king participated by visiting Nabu's temple to receive the royal scepter from the high priest, following an overnight stay in Borsippa, home to renowned Nabu temple. Concurrently, the creation epic Enuma Elish was recited in the house of the New Year. Upon the king's return to Babylon on the 5th of Nisanu, accompanied by Nabu's statue, a series of humble and symbolic acts were performed before Marduk, including the king being struck on the cheek as a ritualistic act of penance. Following this, a hopeful oracle for the future was received, and the king's insignia were returned. The following days saw various gods' statues, including Nabu's, engaging in symbolic battles and rituals, culminating in a grand display to the public on the 8th of Nisanu. This peak moment involved all deities coming together to affirm their guidance for the coming year, reminiscent of a modern State of the Union address, always promising prosperity and success. The festivities included processions through the city to the river, where the gods embarked on a journey to the house of the New Year, where the king personally escorted Marduk. Songs and hymns and various themes were sung, celebrating Ishtar, humorously degrading Enlil, and questioning the gods' absence from their temples, to which they replied their need to be with Marduk. While the specific activities in the house of the New Year on the 9th and 10th of Nisanu remain a mystery, it is believed that sacrifices were made, possibly human sacrifice as well, and war spoils presented to the gods. The festivals concluded with the gods' return to Esagila, reiterating their annual policy before bidding Nabu farewell and dispersing. The Akitu festival endured for many centuries beyond Babylon, with celebrations in places like Palmyra and Emesa and Syria, and even being introduced to Italy by the Roman Emperor Elagabalus in the 3rd century of the Common Era. During the Severan dynasty, Eastern religious influence began to take its course throughout the Roman Empire. Another ancient festival celebrated at the spring equinox is the Zaku festival of the Assyrians. The Assyrians have two major festivals celebrated at opposite times of the year: the Kisu festival, celebrated at the same time as the Hebrew Sukkot, the fall equinox, and the Zaku festival was celebrated on the same day as Passover, the 14th of Nisan, which is the 14th day of the new year, the spring equinox. These two equinox festivals are the largest and most documented in the Assyrian tablets dug up at Nineveh. Arnaud Daniel, famous Assyriologist who has written extensively on this subject, has proposed that these festivals are a commemoration of the gods and goddesses' descent to the underworld and later resurrection. The rite of laying down the statue of Ninkur was a symbolic gesture of the burial of the goddess. The presence of the mourning woman figures and rites of mourning also gives much credence to this theory as well. At the Zaku festival at Nineveh, sacred to the god Dagon, which, according to the tablets found at Nineveh, was celebrated on, drumroll please, the 14th day of Nisan, where the text actually reads on the 14th day of the new year, which coincides to Nisan 14, which is the same day as the Passover and the same day Jesus was crucified. 70 unblemished lambs were sacrificed for this festival. Unblemished lambs is exactly what the tablets specifically call for, and 70 total, which is a number that anyone who knows about Passover will think I'm lying about, because during the 7-day Passover festival, 7 lambs are slaughtered. The unblemished lamb sacrifice is what is in Deuteronomy. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of this first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord, and on the 7th day hold a sacred assembly and do no work.
On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord an unblemished lamb without any defect. Moses.
I'm sorry, Moses, but I'm pretty sure that you did not get this command from Yahweh. Here's what the Nineveh tablets say about Zakru on the exact same day and the exact same week. The first offerings of Zakru festival are sacrificed on the 14th of the month, the head of the year. It says, on the 14th day, they offer 70 unblemished lambs provided by the king for all 70 gods. The 70 lambs are to be sacrificed to each of the 70 gods of Amar. And another text prescribes that 70 doves be distributed between them. You can find the same primary sources that I found from these 2 peer-reviewed articles and 1 book. One is the 70 bowls sacrificed at Sukkot by Noga Ayala Darshan, Department of Hebrew and Semitic Languages at Bar Ilan University, Israel, and the other is the god Dagon in Bronze Age Syria by Louis Feliu. They are the ones who translated these. So not only do we have festivals of Zakru celebrated on the same exact day as Passover for the same 7-day duration of Passover, but both Passover and Zakru call for the sacrifice of a single unblemished lamb for each god, and one for Yahweh, one for each of the 70 gods of Nineveh. But this also means that Jesus, as the lamb sacrifice, has his origins in a pagan Assyrian religion. The Dagon of the garden is an epithet of Dagon that is venerated at Zakru. This also gives more plausibility to the interpretation by Assyriologist Arnaud Daniel that this festival was one that was related to the death and resurrection of gods of agriculture. Also, just as Passover is deeply linked to the Sukkot at the fall equinox, the Zakru is deeply tied to the Kisu festival at the fall equinox. Both the Hebrew Sukkot and the Assyrian Kisu are 7 days long, and they both call for the sacrifice of exactly 70 bulls, a connection that is too specific to be coincidence. 70 lambs sacrificed at the Zakru and 70 bulls at the Kisu are representative of the 70 gods who serve under Dagon. In the book of Enoch, there were 70 shepherds slaughtered as a prophecy for 70 prophets who will be martyred before the coming of the Messiah. There are also 70 disciples of Jesus who preach the word about the kingdom of heaven and become martyrs for Christ. Enoch's fallen angels are also symbolic for the fallen gods of the pagan world who serve the interest against Israel. The number 70 is abundant in the ancient world in many sources throughout the Hebrew Bible and Christian texts. Following Arnaud's seasonal resurrection interpretation for the agricultural gods at the Zakru, the underworld part would be personified by deities such as Suala and Rashab. The Zakru ritual of lying down the statue of Ninkor in the temple of Dagon looks like a sacred marriage rite between the divine couple, similar to Ishtar and Tammuz, or Adonis and Venus. Professor Arnaud strengthens his argument for the existence of gods who die and rise by means of the collection of names, as there are theophoric names with the element Yamut, which, according to Professor Arnaud, in principle, may be related to a Syrian word, molt, which means to die. For all these reasons, it is possible to connect the Kisu ritual with some kind of rite related to the commemoration and the remembrance of the marriage of the divine couple, Dagon and Ninkor, which then begs the question, where does the unleavened bread come in? And is this truly special for Israelites and the Exodus? And to this I would say no. Here's why. We have a badly damaged papyrus dating to the year 419 BCE, long after the so-called Exodus, and even long after the Israelites have returned from Babylonian captivity. It's in Aramaic, and it's from Jews living in Jerusalem, writing to the Jews living in Elephantine. It is known by scholars as the Passover Papyrus from Elephantine. The letter states that King Darius II has instructed the Persian satrap Armistice to allow the Jewish garrison at Elephantine to observe a 7-day festival of unleavened bread.